This episode of the Education Matters podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Mental Health Summit, taking place from April 10th to the 12th at the Banff Center in Banff, Alberta. We're diving into important conversations at the intersection of education and mental well-being. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri, and for this special episode, I'm joined by guest host, Dr. Gina Cherkowski. Together, we'll explore how education can support mental health and empower learners in meaningful ways. So let's get started.
I think for me, what it has taught me is that we as a society need to redefine what it means to be successful. And because what they're searching for is this, the gold, that when I reach this position where I make this amount of money, I will be happy. And we know that's not the case. The research does not support that.
We often talk about preparing students for the future, about innovation, academic achievement, and career readiness. But there's a quieter, more urgent question that still doesn't get asked enough. What do we want young people to feel? For all the headlines about the achievement gaps, technology impact, and post-pandemic recovery, emotional development remains an afterthought in far too many schools and systems. And yet, it's the emotional lives of students and of educators that often determine whether learning is even possible. Today's guest, Dr. Marc Brackett, has spent his career challenging that blind spot. A research psychologist and founding director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, Marc has helped bring emotional intelligence into classrooms and businesses around the world. Not as an add-on, but as something that is critical for learning and human development. His best-selling book, Permission to Feel, and his upcoming book, Dealing with Feeling, are reshaping how educators, parents, and leaders think about emotions, learning, and regulation. Marc is also the lead developer of Ruler, a research-based approach to social and emotional learning now used in thousands of schools. But as you'll hear, his interest in emotion wasn't born in a lab. It was born out of silence, personal pain, and ultimately, one powerful relationship with a family member who simply took the time to consider how he was feeling. In this conversation, recorded with today's guest host, Dr. Gina Cherkowski, we explore what an emotionally intelligent school system could look like. We talk about trauma, regulation, teacher burnout, and the difference between suppressing feelings and actually learning to deal with them. We also discuss redefining success, not just by grades and test scores, but how well we navigate life's complexities, and ultimately, how we identify our own feelings. And we conclude this wonderful discussion by touching upon one of Marc's upcoming works, a documentary called Unfiltered America, a listening tour across the U.S. that reveals the emotional lives of people you might never expect to relate to. This is Education Matters. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. So let's dive into my conversation with Dr. Marc Brackett. Marc Brackett, Gina Cherkowski, welcome to the Education Matters podcast. Gina, let's start with you. Where does this podcast find you today?
I am in sunny Calgary, Alberta.
Wonderful. And Marc?
I am in a town called East Haddam, Connecticut.
Excellent. And I trust that you are also experiencing some wonderful weather right now as we turn into spring here.
Today was a good day. It's
Excellent.
Nice to see the sun.
Marc, so I would have given you a proper introduction at this stage, but can you give the audience a sense of what you're up to these days?
What I'm up to is research on emotions and emotional intelligence, and it's finishing my second book that's coming out very soon, which I'm excited about, which is on emotion regulation. It's called Dealing with Feeling, and running around the world trying to get more people to talk about their feelings and have better strategies to deal with them.
Well, excellent. And certainly we're going to get into your work, and I've obviously got the wonderful Dr. Cherkowski here to help me dive into that. But why don't we start with your background? Where and when did you grow up?
So I was born in 1969, which makes me 55. I was born in Clifton, New Jersey, to two parents who love me a lot. They're no longer here. They were good people. I wouldn't say they went to the School of Emotional Intelligence, which maybe is part of the reason why I study this and teach it. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer anything else, but that's my basics.
So what kind of neighborhood, what kind of an upbringing did you have?
So I have two older brothers, but they're significantly older, like 7 and 11 years older. And by the time I was around 6, my two brothers had already left the home because one had some mental health challenges and he needed to be taken care of. And my eldest brother was already off in college. And so I was kind of an only child by the time I was 6. And, if you want to jump into the real nuts and bolts of my childhood, it was not a great childhood because I had, unfortunately, abuse in my childhood, from a neighbor. And, so I suffered sexual abuse for about 4 to 5 years of my childhood. And, it's also part of the reason why I do my work is that, I find it still hard to believe, and this is now going back, 47, 48 years ago. How is it that this young boy at 6 was having this horrible thing happen and I didn't tell anybody about it? Like, how is that possible? Just, it blows my mind that I was in a psychological place that I felt unsafe to talk about what was happening.
Is like, obviously this is, you started the podcast by saying you want to inspire people to continue to open up and give them, permission to feel, so to speak. Was that the origins of this kind of sentiment in your work?
It was. I mean, there's a nicer ending to that because with all the traumatic experiences, which also had a lot of bullying involved in it, even after I disclosed my abuse, unfortunately, the town I lived in, the society I was in was not ready for that. And so it actually backfired in terms of like friendships. Like parents would say things like, don't hang out with Mark, that's like, that family has problems. It's like, my family doesn't have problems. It's like weird mindsets, in terms of parents not knowing how to talk about these things. And so the best strategy they had was to avoid, me, and tell their kids to avoid me, which was pretty painful. But then by some wave of a beautiful magic wand, I had an uncle named Uncle Marvin, who happened to be a teacher, who happened to be writing a curriculum to teach kids about feelings, who happened to stay with us one summer, and who happened to be the first person who asked me with authenticity how I was feeling. And I will tell you that transformed my life and clearly gave me a career.
I find that beautiful that one little moment like that can lead to such extraordinary outcomes.
Yeah, there's research to support it too, because I've studied this stuff. And so not only am I experiencing it, and feeling it, but I've now studied, thousands of people to learn if they had an Uncle Marvin or an Aunt Medea. And it is a powerful influence that, having that one adult who has that unconditional love, what they can do for you in your life.
Was it your uncle that inspired learning in you? Do you remember what you first loved learning?
Well, I've always been a curious kid. I've always, been like, I was precocious as a kid, but I was not a good student. I was a C and D student for most of my childhood. And then after the abuse, it got worse because I was bullied and I was afraid to go to school. And actually, I don't know if I ever shared this like this, but now that you're asking me, my uncle, when he was getting his graduate degrees in psychology, tested me on my IQ because he was learning how to deliver these tests. And, I had a high IQ. And it was like such validation because like I knew I was capable and smart, but I just could not perform well academically. And it was a real eye-opening experience for me to see objectively that I had this ability. Now, 30 years later, as a scientist who studies this stuff, I realize, well, of course, your emotions got the best of your cognition. When you're in a classroom and kids are writing on you and you're being thrown into a locker and you're being spit on the bus and you're being beat up on the way home, it's really hard to enjoy school. It's really hard to be engaged in a classroom and absorb information when your brain is thinking who's going to hurt me today? How am I going to get home safely?
Sure. Just in survival mode all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that must have been so difficult. How because obviously, I mean, you're at Yale, you're writing books, you're doing such amazing things. Now, you had that, obviously, you mentioned loving family, and obviously that helped you through it. And then, of course, your uncle that really starts to impact how you think and give you that confidence. How did you find your way into academia?
Actually, what happened is I was going to be everything. I was going to be an actor. I was going to be a teacher. I also have a 5th degree black belt in a Korean martial art called Hapkido. So I was a martial arts instructor. I was going to be an entrepreneur, maybe a lawyer. I mean, I was kind of all over the place. Even in college, I majored in psychology and Spanish and criminal justice. And then I was not, I didn't like college that much either. I also was figuring out who I was as a human being in college at every level possible. And I share that because I was in therapy, and it was the beginning of the big self-help era. Everybody's all these books on, motivation, and a book came out in 1995 called Emotional Intelligence. And I read that book and was inspired by that book, and actually called my uncle and said, Uncle Marvin, 10 years ago, when we were talking about these things, in my backyard, this is it. It's something, it's called emotional intelligence. And I think that, everything that you do with me is a real thing, and we should get together and we should write a curriculum. And I did pull him out of retirement. And we started writing a book together to teach middle school kids about their feelings. And in doing that, I read the book, and I realized I had no credibility. I was not a great student. I had a bachelor's degree in psychology and Spanish. Who's going to buy a book from a 24-year-old, who was selling skincare and teaching martial arts? And so it didn't make any sense. So I read this book. I look at the references, and it says, the original theory in small print. Peter Salovey, Yale University, Jack Mayer, University of New Hampshire. And so I had the courage to call these guys and ask them if they would meet with me. And I did. They both agreed. They both had lunch with me. And then the guy at Yale said, you're really nice, but, you're not going to get in. And then he's recommended me to his good friend, Jack, who was at the University of New Hampshire, that had less, stringent and stereotypical pathways. I was not a stereotypical, Ivy League kind of person. And so I got my PhD with Jack up in New Hampshire. And then that also let me think about the science to then help with my uncle in the practice. And my whole goal was to merge the practical stuff that my uncle had talked about that didn't have any, there was no, evidence to support it or theories behind it. And then I was learning all the theory, and I'm this is perfect. We can merge these two things and then create a program, which we did. And then we failed. And that's a whole nother podcast.
But I mean, I do love the stories of folks that take a little bit of time to discover what their place in the world is. And I also love that image of a very good looking, good skinned, dangerous black belt.
There you go. Well, I'll take the attribution. Yeah. But also the martial arts informed my thinking about Ruler, which is our, model to teach emotional intelligence, because there's a lot of psychology in the martial arts.
Yeah. So actually, that was one of my follow-up questions, because I have a black belt in Taekwondo myself.
Oh, okay,
And
cool.
It was maybe from a similar angle, in the sense that my father looked at my stature and having the strong Sicilian genes, knew that I wasn't going to be, 6 foot tall and and I was pretty scrawny. So he put me in there to defend myself, and I felt, and I started I wasn't bullied at the point where I was starting it, but I always, and people have commented on this later, that I've always carried myself with a certain amount of confidence. And I think it was largely due to the Taekwondo. What were your experiences like? How did you feel it changed the way you thought, and some of the lessons you took from it?
I mean, there's so many things. But interestingly enough, I don't know why, today I'm very talking about all the challenges that I faced. I became very successful at the martial arts very quickly. It was an intellectual martial art too, which is what I appreciated. It wasn't just, kicking and punching. There was a lot of intricacies with the techniques and the locks and the flips and all the different stuff. And so I had these two great teachers, but, once I got my black belt, I was curious about other teachers. And so I started going to other teachers and people that they introduced me to as well. And that led me to another teacher that led me to another teacher that was in Korea. And I traveled to Korea quite a bit to work with this particular teacher. But then my original teacher started hating me. They were mean to me.
Because you went to Korea?
Yeah, because I betrayed them. They were, they thought I was arrogant because I didn't think they were good enough to be my teachers.
Right.
Which in retrospect, they weren't. I mean, the truth was these people were they were really, really skilled martial arts, masters, and I was ready for that next level. And it's funny, that's impacted me as a teacher, because I'm a professor. I develop people to be professors and to be researchers. And I really work, on my ego about that, because, my martial arts studio had this sign that said, check your ego at the door. And in retrospect, everybody had their ego, because it was the antithesis of what I experienced. And I really have approached my career with a lot of humility. I know that I have people on my team who are smarter than I am. I know I have people on my team who are better statisticians than I am, who maybe read more than I do. And I just want to elevate them, because I'm not going to be here forever. And my dream is that, this work will live and last forever. And let's nurture people, in ways that make them want to contribute and be part of the dream.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, I always think of coaching trees. The real successful leaders and coaches produce more successful leaders and coaches. In your case, sounds like you're creating a wonderful kind of ecosystem of thinkers and researchers along these lines. Before I kick it over to Gina to dive into your work a little bit more deeply, I'm curious to ask your experience as an educator, as someone who's seeing students come through the K-12 system, which is mainly the audience of this podcast would be senior administrators in the K-12 system in Canada, US, and then a lot of ed tech professionals. So I'd be remiss if I don't ask you any questions about your view of students as they come into, your world, how you feel they're prepared. And then I want to ask you some questions about the system itself. So if we could start with, your view on students and maybe from the perspective of what it is you think what kind of support you think they need once they get to your door.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to know, my door is a weird door. Just because Yale is a unique institution, it's an Ivy League place. So everybody who gets in, has the best test scores, the best grades. They play sports that I didn't even know were real sports. They play instruments I didn't know that were instruments. They visited countries that I didn't even know existed. These are the top performers from their high schools. And so it is a skewed sample. But with that said, for a lot of my career, and when I first got to Yale, I was young, not that young. I was 31, 32. But, I had students who were 18, 19, 20 years old. I wasn't that much older than they were. And I had a lot of envy, because I didn't grow up with that. I was,
Mm.
I'm a kid who had parents who were anxious and angry. And, my father was a blue collar worker. My mother had different jobs, but not really. I had the abuse. I had the bullying. Nobody read to me. So like I was in a space that I did not feel I belonged in. And, people call that imposter syndrome.
Mm.
That's what I felt. And I also had this like fantasy that, all of my students, they were all going to be Nobel laureates and, Hollywood producers and, hedge fund managers and, successful and wealthy. And now I've been, working at Yale for 23 years. And it's not the case. As a matter of fact, of course, many of them are extraordinarily successful, and most of my students are just great people.
Mm.
But they're bundles of anxiety. A large percentage of the students have anxiety. They also have fixed mindsets, many of them, which is contrary to what you might believe. Because, like, how would they have a fixed mindset? Well, they've been taught their whole life it's about performance. It's about success. It doesn't matter like what you're learning. It matters that you get the good grade. And so like on my course on emotional intelligence, oftentimes students will say things like, just tell me what's going to be on the test. And I'm like, I don't even care about the test, like, I don't know, whatever.
I haven't written it yet.
Yeah. I don't even like want to write the questions because I think they're all boring.
Yeah.
This is a course on experiential learning, right? I want you to like feel it, and I want you to like journal, and I want you to go out in the world, and I want you to think about how, are you reading people accurately? How are you regulating? How is your regulation affecting your relationships? Like, that's what I'm interested in them thinking about and learning. And they struggle with that because there's no like criteria, it's like, I don't know what to do. I need to get the A so I can go to medical school or law school or get my PhD. And so I find that quite interesting, and sad, and I try to help my students look at things a little differently, that, because what we find with students like that is that, they get their job at Goldman Sachs, and then they get a master's and an MBA at Harvard, and then they get a bigger job at another firm. And then they're like 40 years old. They're working 100 hours a week. They, are not that physically healthy. They're burnt out. They're angry. They're sad. They drink too much. And then they like kind of have regrets, that they didn't live their life even, And so, but you can't tell students that because it doesn't work. Anyway, I think for me, what it has taught me is that we as a society need to redefine what it means to be successful. And because what they're searching for is this, the gold, that when I reach this position or I make this amount of money, I will be happy. And we know that's not the case. The research does not support that. So anyhow.
No, that's wonderful. It actually leads into my next question, which is how much of this do you think is a product of the education system, the K-12 system, in terms of how it's structured, how it's organized, how students are rewarded, how they get accepted into Ivy Leagues and other universities and colleges?
Yeah, I mean, we're all the problem too. Of course, we need some kind of objective criteria to, it is harder at a place like Yale. The expectations are greater. So you need people that can do the work and, have the abilities. But at the same time, it's like, I think the pressure cooker of, the American US, education system, I'm sure it's similar in Canada and elsewhere, the pressure, to, get the best grades and the best test scores, as if like at 17 years old, as if being 18 years old and, first year college student, like you're supposed to have all the answers for what you want to do in life. I mean, truthfully, even after I met, was in therapy and I was writing my, this curriculum with my uncle, and then I went for a master's degree in forensics, and I was in such a exploration phase of my life. And every one of those little experiences, from the martial arts to, obviously my childhood, to working with my uncle, to getting rejected at Yale, to then getting a graduate degree, then getting to Yale, to getting, like all of that, I feel really is important in terms of like life learning. And I feel like most of my students think that there's no life. You just like go, and you go from like perfect, you play a sport, you get the perfect scores, you go to Yale, you get your A's, you go to medical school, and then you get your internship, and then your residency, then you become a doctor, then you have your practice, or you become a professor. And it's like, just like so linear. And I don't know that they're the most interesting people.
My life kind of, I want to say, it changed the moment I read Death of a Salesman. I kind of feel like that should be just like mandatory reading for folks. And it used to be. I don't know what's happened to it, but maybe they don't pay attention to it as much. But Gina, I want to kick it over to you.
One more comment though about that, just because I think it's funny you mentioned that book or play. For about 20 years of my life, I called myself the Willy Loman of social and emotional learning. Because I was like, with my little bags of booklets and my posters, knocking on these doors for principals, like, you want to talk about your feelings? No. You want to talk about your feelings? No. Anyhow.
That's a nice, maybe that's a topic for another podcast, the centrality of that work to American life. But I always thought, that was one of the great examples of, of just living this really scripted and formalized life without meaning, and obviously what it leads to. But I digress. Let's dive into some of your work and give the audience a sense of
thank you
of what you've been up to.
Gina's just been sitting around waiting. I feel terrible.
Oh, listening and having a good time.
Here she comes now, Mark. Here she comes.
All right.
There's so much to talk about. Mark, one of the things that you've talked about is that we're not born with knowing about our feelings and knowing how to regulate our feelings, that's all learned. And in Permission to Feel, you talk about rulers. So I was hoping you could just explain a little bit of that to our audience.
Sure. Well, I think just going back to what you started with is that, there's this, people have different mindsets, about like the origin of your emotional intelligence. And some people think like you're born that way. And I'm here to tell people, not really. You're born with a temperament. You're born with a proclivity to experience the world. You want a lot of sensation, or you want kind of a more quiet life. But that's personality and temperament, not skill. And when you think about the skills of emotional intelligence, we use the acronym RULER for those: recognizing emotions, understanding emotions, labeling emotions, expressing emotions, and regulating emotions. Let's just start with the recognition of emotion. We think, because of not so great television shows and movies, that that these stereotypical facial expressions are emotions, right? So if I do this, how am I feeling?
Right. Happy.
Yeah. I look happy. Inside, I'm thinking, I hate these people. Now, I like you guys, but I was thinking that in my head, just as a joke, to show you that you can display one emotion and feel, right, something else, which means, importantly, that the facial expression can be very misleading. So when we think we're reading people's emotions, I'm not so sure, I mean, how many of us in the workplace have felt contempt for someone at work, our bosses, And we don't do this, you know, how many of you, when you've been in a real workplace, how many of your colleagues have ever done this in a meeting? Right. Nobody does that because it's like, you would be like, what's going on with Mark? He's a weirdo. But people turn to a neighbor, you know, a partner or somebody they do this kind of thing like, real quick, like, right. You get those quick little like reactions. And so my point here is that, it's a learned skill. Meaning after you have lived with someone, let's say your husband, your wife for 20 years, and you've seen, you know, my husband is a filmmaker. Okay. So there's a lot of rejection in filmmaking. Mm-hmm. And so you get the phone call, like, you know, you think you're going to get this part. He's a cinematographer. Think you're going to get the job to make the movie. And then it's like, you know, sorry, you know, we went with somebody else. Let's just use that as an example. So I've had so many instances of those phone calls in our home where there's like the excitement, the phone call, and then this facial expression that's clearly disappointment, even hopelessness sometimes when it's something you really, really wanted. Now, after being in this relationship for 30 years, I'm really good at detecting the emotion from the facial expression, but it's only because I understand the deep insides of that person's experience. So I just think people tend to think, oh, you're going to show kids these little facial expressions. That's happy, sad, angry, fear, surprise, disgust. And I feel like that's just such an inappropriate way to really get people to understand emotions. Understanding emotion. Why do I feel this way? Where does it come from? You know, we have a language for emotions. That's labeling emotions. Those two things are really inextricably linked. So we try to understand that there are themes for emotions. Anger is about injustice. Disappointment is about unmet expectations. And so we can make those connections between an event that might, you know, you feel like it's going to work out and it doesn't work out. Okay, we're going to label that disappointment. Where someone is mean or hurtful and says something unkind and you get angry. Oh, that's an injustice. So injustice leads to anger. But then even within the anger family or the disappointment family, there's a lot of variation. Am I peeved, irritated, angry, livid, enraged? Am I down, sad, disappointed, devastated, hopeless, full of despair, or depressed? There's a lot of granularity. So that's the RUL of emotional intelligence. The E and the R is about expressing emotions, knowing how and when to express emotion with different people. There are rules, right? Even between Canada and New York City, like, you know, Calgary, if I said that right, you know, in New York. I'm sure there's subtle differences in the way people express emotions. You go to Korea, right? You go to, you know, I was in Myanmar giving a speech a couple of years ago. I'm like done with my speech and I'm like, thank you. And no movement. And I'm like, uh-oh, this was not good. And I'm like, thank you. And I'm waiting to like, what do I do here? And then all of a sudden the head person, this woman who was in charge of the whole event, she stood up and clapped. And then everybody had permission to clap. But they were all waiting for the authority figure to show her emotion before they showed theirs. And so that's a cultural rule, right? Nobody does that in New York City. People just express their feelings. They yell at me during my presentations in New York City. And then finally, regulation. What are the strategies, you know, that we use to, as I say in my new book, deal with our feelings?
You mentioned that regulation is actually the most important skill for over the course of our lifetime. For many reasons, it impacts our life in so many different ways. Do you want to talk a little bit about why emotional regulation is so critical, developing those skills?
Yeah. I mean, just think about it. You know, what is it like to be around someone who doesn't regulate well? Let me ask either one of you that. Mm-hmm. Have you ever lived with someone or worked with someone who is emotionally dysregulated often?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And how many of you, what do you think about, like, in terms of like being with that person all day long?
Yeah, it is exhausting. And, you might try to pick them up if it's a negative feeling, but it does get exhausting, or a little bit of, there's a feeling of being on eggshells.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so it's difficult to be around people who are dysregulated. So the relational piece of it is like, we feel it, right? They're kind of impacting our nervous system. But then think about yourself. Think about what it's like to be someone who has strong emotions and doesn't know what to do with them. Really difficult. Like anxiety, if you don't know how to regulate anxiety or sadness, or, think about that. I mean, life is filled with feedback and disappointments and frustrations and anxieties. And if you allow those emotions to get the best of you, my hunch is that you're probably not going to achieve your goals in life. Mm-hmm. So this is going back to that. I talked about success earlier. My dream, and, the new book that I wrote really wants people to imagine their identities being in part based on their ability to regulate emotions in healthy ways. Like, I want to see myself as a husband, as a friend, as a boss who is like really skilled at dealing with his feelings. That's kind of my goal.
One part of your new book, which, thank you. I'm so excited that I've been reading.
You got a sneak peek. That's not fair.
I know. I'm so lucky.
They didn't tell me you were getting a copy of it.
Yeah. Well, it was a shock when it came, and I instantly opened it up and started digging through it. It's very exciting for me. I love the fact that you talked about quick fixes versus slow, and how sometimes people with anxiety, just as you were just mentioning, anxiety, are told to sort of suppress it, and that actually dealing with our feelings isn't suppressing it or even fixing it. Do you want to talk a little bit about slow?
Yeah, I think the goal of that, like, core principle is radical acceptance of emotions. And I say that because I'm someone who is prone to experiencing anxiety. I worry a lot. I worry about why I worry. And I even worry about why I worry about why I worry. And the truth is, I don't have that much to worry about anymore. But, this is thanks to my mom and my grandfather, like, something wrong will happen, It's terrible to have that kind of automatic, experience. I've learned to, like, observe it though and not live it. And so when that feeling comes on, I'm like, oh, my friend anxiety is trying to visit me today. And Mark, is there anything that you're actually anxious about? No. So I just approach it with curiosity, and then all of a sudden it's like my curiosity is more interesting than the feeling itself. If that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
Mark,
yeah.
Can I ask you a follow-up to that?
Sure.
And this might sound like trying to get free therapy here, but bear with me.
I'll send you my bank account.
When I experience that, there are times that, like, I'll do that kind of check, like, I have a great relationship with my wife, with my children, with my brother, my sister, my friend. Like, I've got zero to complain about. I'm doing what I've always wanted to do. I'm working on with my brothers, like, and yet I still get that feeling. And what recommendations, what suggestions you have for folks when you can't quite pinpoint what it is?
Yeah. Well, I think just approach it with curiosity. Just say, what am I doing right now? What am I thinking about? What's happening in the back of my mind about what might be going on tomorrow? Oftentimes you'll get some insights through curiosity. Now, I'm going to tell you something else that's also important, which is that not everything is an emotion. So what does that mean? Well, sometimes you're hungry. Sometimes you're tired.
Check.
And I have this problem because I'm a workaholic. And you know, what happens when you're tired and you're burnt out from a day of work? Your body starts shutting down. And so what your brain does is it starts interpreting your body. And I'm like shaking and I'm like, just like, ugh. And then all of a sudden I'm like, I'm anxious. And I'm like, Mark, you're just tired. Go to bed. Shut the freaking computer. Stop making up the feeling. You're like, your body is like falling apart. Go to freaking bed. And then I go to bed and I'm fine. And so we have to, that curiosity can help us recognize what emotion is actually happening. It might not be anxiety. It might be frustration. It might be disappointment. Or it might help you realize that, you know, there's another need that's not being met, like food, you know, or sleep.
Sort of being the emotional scientist, as you talk about,
Right.
but also just checking in with yourself to see what else might be going on.
Yeah. And also, let me just, something important about that, which is that we also have feelings about feelings. We call those meta emotions. And so if we believe, this is chapter 7, sneak peek. I think maybe chapter 6. But they're important because oftentimes we're dealing with the meta emotion, not the emotion itself. What I mean by that is that we start judging, oh, I must be weak because I'm anxious. I'm a dude. Like, dudes don't get anxious. So you say, well, you know, no, I'm pissed. Actually, I'm not anxious because that's more masculine. Or you're embarrassed, you know, that you're anxious. And so you don't get the help you need because you're embarrassed to tell somebody that you're feeling anxiety. And I don't think we should underestimate our mindsets about our emotion states.
Yeah, that's powerful. One last question from me is, how can parents and educators integrate Ruler into their daily practices to help support students with the skills for emotional intelligence? Because I know in our schools and some of our homes, like in our homes and schools, this is something we're not doing as much as we need to be doing.
Say it again. I agree. I think part of it is that the adults who are leading schools and teaching students didn't have the emotion education themselves. So they don't recognize the need necessarily. They may recognize it when they go for therapy, but they're not, this is not therapy, right? This is skill building. And I think that's important to distinguish because there's some confusion in the world of social and emotional learning that people confuse this as if like we're asking kids to talk all day about their problems. Definitely not what we want them to be doing. If they have a problem, we want them to feel safe to share that problem. And we want to help them identify the feeling that's associated with that problem and also learn how to deal with their own emotions, but also deal with their relationships and their friendships and their conflicts. And so I think, you know, the first step, you know, we have a tool that's very popular called the Mood Meter. I should share that we have an app that we built that's extraordinarily beautiful, I can say, because I didn't design it. I'm the scientist part of it, but the designers are just these amazing people that worked, you know, with Pinterest and then now with our How We Feel project. And it's a tool that helps people build emotional self-awareness. There are these quadrants, the yellow, red, the blue, and the green. I can just show you a sneak peek of it. And so right here, for those of you who are looking, so the yellow quadrant are these emotions that are high energy and pleasant, happy, excited, optimistic, joyful. The green quadrant are emotions that are lower in energy, but pleasant still, like calm, content, tranquil, peaceful. The blue is low energy and unpleasant. Notice I say unpleasant, not negative. That's sad, down, disappointment, loneliness. And then the red has a mixture of anger and anxiety. So from feeling uncomfortable to feeling terrorized, or from feeling peeved to being enraged. And so that tool is, I bet, well, we've had 2 million people use our app. So that's pretty incredible. And there are, a minimum of 5,000 schools that use our program that's Ruler, that's in schools. So you multiply that by, Ruler's been around for 20 something years. We're talking upwards of 7 to 10 million kids across the world that are using this tool. And the feedback is always positive because our emotional lives are complex. It's hard to I don't know. I don't know how I'm feeling. I don't know. And all of a sudden it's well, how pleasant are you? How much energy do you got? Okay, let's make sense out of that. And then you have this tool with these 4 quadrants and you say, I'm yellow, red, blue, or green, or all the above. Okay, well, what's causing you to have your feelings? What's the exact feeling? Do you want to share it? Is it time to express it? Do you need to do anything about it? Is it time to regulate it? And so the mood meter is a tool that helps us apply the skills of emotional intelligence to help ourselves and other people.
Well, we'll make sure we share that with the audience. We'll make sure it's linked in the notes here and when we share it on socials. Right. But on that note, Marc, you obviously have been doing work with schools, and it's obviously a big part of the conference that we're all attending together.
I know.
If I could ask you, if you had a magic wand and you can, reform the public education system in your image or your vision, what would you do?
It would be reading, writing, arithmetic, and Ruler. And I'm joking, but not really. I do believe that we have done a disservice to children's healthy development by not incorporating the principles and skills of emotional intelligence into their education. These are critical life skills. These are the skills that help us have better attention in school, or we concentrate better when we have skills. They help us make more informed decisions. They help us build and maintain healthy relationships. They help us with our mental health, and they help us achieve our dreams. So why wouldn't we make this a permanent part?
Well, let me push on that a bit more, Marc, because I know you're aware, teachers, and this is what I say to my friends that are outside the education system and everybody, the Dunning-Kruger effect. They think they can fix it all really easily from the outside. And then I just give them, I'm like, okay, listen, here's the reality. There's 30 kids in the class, right? The teacher has to teach the math, the arithmetic. She has to make it engaging. She has to then deal with it for all the levels of the different learners. Someone's a grade 3 level while they're in grade 6. Somebody's a grade 9 reading level when they're in grade 6. And so the teacher has to accommodate for this. And then on top of everything, the teacher has to, especially in this day and age, understand the emotional lives of their kids and how to do that. That is an extraordinarily complex job. And I haven't even talked about new technology adoption, physical activity for the kids, and all these other complicated things. So let me, with that in mind, right? And this is why I just want to make sure you take the chance to articulate your vision here, because you have an all-powerful magic wand. You can do whatever it takes. Now, Ruler will be part of that, but what does that look like? Does it start with teacher education, so teachers are more prepared themselves to understand the emotional lives of their students? Is it, structures that need to change from, organizing kids by grade level, or, I just wanted to push you a little bit further on what you would do.
Well, I imagine a world where governments and policymakers are emotionally intelligent, because it starts there. If we create policies that we know are harming children from developing in healthy ways, we're starting kids off, in a very uncomfortable and at a disadvantage. So I would like to start there. If I had the magic wand, that government officials would be required to understand how the policies they make impact healthy child development. And then, getting into schools, state departments of education need to be advocates for this work. Superintendents of schools need to make sure this is part of the curriculum. School leaders have to create the accountability metrics to ensure that it's getting implemented and recognize that they have to be the role models for it. And then we would have a developmentally scaffolded curriculum from preschool to high school. and it would be incorporated into teacher prep so that the basic skills they've learned in terms of the science, of emotion and the skills, and then they learn how to apply that in their classroom setting in a developmentally appropriate way.
Wonderful.
Was that clear?
That was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
That was very
And from the work I've done, the implementation science of programs that are social emotional learning programs, that work definitely shows that we need the leaders and the teachers on board with understanding for themselves. And then they can go ahead and support as Jody Carrington says, the little people. Yeah. And so I really think that I echo Marc's words and his wishes. And I think that's how that we can really transform schools and help set students up over the course of their lifetime for success, because emotional regulation and the skills of ruler, we need those into the future because our lives and our world is going to continue to be complex. Mm-hmm. We can't change the things that are happening around us. So we need to be able to apply these skills in our life to help us be our best self.
Couldn't agree more.
And Gina, you got me right to my next question. With the growing complexity in the world, Marc, what worries you? What keeps you up at night?
I think what keeps me up at night is, a few things keep me up at night. I think that people struggle with listening and people lead with judgment. And I just find that so unfortunate. And the need for power over the need for healthy relationships also keeps me up at night. I'll leave it there. That's enough.
On the flip side of that, what are you hopeful for?
For the emotion revolution, baby. I'm hopeful that myself and Gina and other people, who understand the science of healthy development, we can all work together to ensure that this generation of kids and future generations learn the skills they need to navigate their lives and to find the purpose and meaning, that's going to help them, have that life that's worth living.
Beautiful. And always the last question, Marc. What podcast, book, video, movie? It could be one of your husband's movies. Not that I'm saying you're pressured to recommend your husband's movie to the audience, but anything you would recommend that you really loved or something that's really made you think or feel more.
It's funny you asked that because I actually produced a movie this year. I produced it 5 years ago, and it's coming out on Amazon and other streaming services on April 25th. And it's called America Unfiltered. And it is an intense story of two immigrants, one of them being my husband, who's from Panama, the other being a Russian immigrant, who during the pandemic spent 1 year driving across America, interviewing people about what it means to be an American and what it feels like to live in the United States during the pandemic, during the election cycle. And they didn't interview like my friend who's a professor at Stanford and my friend who's a professor at the University of Arizona. They interviewed people, who were gun shop owners, who were moms whose kids were murdered by the police, who undocumented immigrants who, really had a very difficult life and, escaped their country or they would have been killed, to people in the Appalachian Mountains who wanted to be in the KKK. These are intense stories. And I think what's beautiful about it is that in the end, it became a listening tour. And it was a movie that I think could inspire hope that if you looked at many of the people that were interviewed, you'd say, I'm not sure I could be a friend with that person. I'm not sure I want to go for coffee with them. I'm not sure I even want to be in the same room with them. And then they share their stories and you want to cry with them because they struggled with their relationships with their parents, or they got addicted to drugs without knowing they got addicted to drugs, and the list goes on. And so we're really excited about it, and hope it will inspire rich conversations.
Wonderful. I look forward to seeing it and also share that here in the podcast.
Thank you.
Marc, Gina, thank you for your time.
Thank you both.
Thank you. We'll see you in April, Marc.
Yeah.
This podcast is recorded on the Territory and Treaty 13 lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and on the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee. The show is edited and produced by the marvelous and talented Andrew Mastroianni. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe to us on Spotify or wherever you listen to your podcast. Until next time, remember, there's absolutely no inevitability as long as there's a willingness to contemplate what's happening. I'm your host, Jason Bucheri. Until next time.